Hello and welcome to the very first Football Explains Life podcast with your host Jack Kennedy. To kick off, we have two topics that we have to explain before we get started. The first is the concept of the podcast. Second is the theme of today's episode. So to give you an idea of what we'll talk about, each episode will look at an interest I've developed thanks to football. So just for an example, I won't give away my whole show. But say I got into design and fashion to do with like club kits, logos, and even sportswear like boots, that kind of thing. That can be a starting point for a discussion about why a club looks a certain way or why a player changed boots for this certain way. So it just gives me an excuse to talk about football from a different angle. Hopefully it'll delve into the topics in depth than that kit had some great vibes or something like that. That really annoys me in podcasts now. People talk about something from back in the day, but not really actually talk about it. They'll just basically mention it, and you could actually explain why it's good instead of just saying, those jerseys were fire or something like that. On to today's topic, where we'll be looking from a real broad stereotype of what kind of player encapsulates exactly how a national team thinks they play or wants to play, and what's the one player that symbolises that. So I'm going to look at about 8 nations and just look at the player that really sums up that idea. Now, take my ideas with a grain of salt. It ultimately means nothing. It's really just a discussion, and I do encourage everyone who listens to participate and comment on who they actually think does, or if they disagree, totally open to that. That's what this podcast is more about. It's more about having discussions. This isn't a podcast for Ronaldo versus Messi, who's the greatest player ever. That doesn't interest me. And to be honest, I don't think you'll learn that much from that argument. That's something I think that's just been taken from NBA arguments where they just never go anywhere. You never answer that question. It's more about who do you like more. You'll find an argument to suit whoever. So this is kind of the players that I think by what I believe each nation brings at tournaments and really represents. But at the same time, it's just a good excuse to talk about a bunch of really good players for pretty much the nations that stand out the most in World Cups. So without further ado, we'll start with our first nation, Argentina. And this would have to be the most open and shut one for narrowing it down at the very least to 2 players between Maradona and Messi. It's as simple as that. Look, there's tons and tons of players that Argentina have had that actually probably encapsulate what they actually perform like at a World Cup. At tournaments for the most part, a lot better than them too, because ultimately Argentina don't win everything, and them 2 players seem to signify winning more than just about anyone, and yet that's not really how the country performs. But in saying that, both players definitely play a way that typifies what Argentina want to see in a player in their teams and what they want their teams to play like. I'm going to break it down. I'll start with Maradona. You look at how Argentine football was sort of developed, and it's from that mix of Spanish and Italian roots that they have, along with the English bringing the game to South America. See where the passion for the game originated from them, but unlike Brazil, where I guess people would declare it as a samba style, the need to Yoga Benito, the need to attack and play really entertaining football, which the Argies definitely do just as easily. There's a sort of a need to read the game as well, I think, because without putting it lightly, a lot of the defenders they have had at club football level, especially in Argentina, before they go overseas, tend to be pretty bad hackers if we're looking at broad stereotypes. So reading the game, if you want to preserve yourself and play for as long as possible and get to Europe and show what you can do, requires a really good level of reading the game, as well as that incredible skill to get around defenders. And it certainly was the case with Maradona, who did have to do that in Argentina before he went over to Barcelona. But it was actually at Barcelona, weirdly enough, where he had to develop his game to get around such extreme defenders. particular against the Butchers of Bilbao, who just absolutely hacked him to pieces in a game, and it really made him consider how he played. And there's a very good documentary that goes into that and his time at Napoli. It's well worth looking at. But ultimately, he was a player that played off a feel so much more than anyone else. He sort of read the game incredibly well, basically better than anyone until a certain someone came along. His trials at Barcelona and then moving to Napoli were what prepared him for the ultimate test in 1986, where, of course, he put on that masterclass against England and willed his team to a World Cup win. But the point I'm getting at here, obviously everyone knows he's great. There's no argument there. The point I'm getting at is that everything he did in these situations seems to have informed Messi's career in a completely different way and affected him both for good and bad. And I'll just go into that now. Both seem to involve Barcelona heavily. But the first thing is the reading of the game. Now, obviously, Maradona was impeccable at reading the game, but it did seem to be almost at the game level. Like he wasn't seeing it before. He was sort of more a reactionary guy, even though like it was still spectacular. It was sort of on a whim kind of thing. I'd probably liken it to, say you have instructions to build a barbecue. Diego's a master craftsman. He puts it together without the instructions, basically. He looks at the barbecue, knows where it has to go, puts it together. I look at Messi. He's downloaded the instructions before the boxes arrived, understands every part of the manual, gets the barbecue, puts the barbecue together. People can't really understand how he's put it together so easily, but that's why. He's worked it out long before the situations even arose. It comes from that Barcelona method with the quadrants and knowing what role each player plays, what you need to do in each section of the field, studying the opposition, knowing exactly what you need to do. And I don't think Diego really did that. I don't think you really need to look too far into it to understand he definitely didn't. But he definitely informed that kind of thinking, because that hacking that he suffered was certainly a way of not reading what was coming immediately and playing a different way. Obviously, you want to play your own way, but sometimes that's not always possible. And Messi's a lot better at choosing those situations, especially in the younger days. He did have more of them runs that are much more similar to Maradona. These days, he's picking his spots more, but even so, he can still do an amazing job at that. So that's the first bit. Second part, where Barcelona maybe have worsened Messi's effect or lessened Messi's effect on Argentina, come from basically from that amazing Guardiola team where every player has a role and you can sort of rely on every player. Whereas Maradona, I think, even Barcelona didn't so much have him, but Napoli, where even though they did have quality players, he was the guy and he was used to carrying them on a weekly basis. Now, I'm not saying Messi didn't absolutely stand up and perform for Barcelona. Everyone knows he did. But at the same time, you have guys like Iniesta, Xavi, all them wide guys, forwards at different times, incredible players that you absolutely can rely on in all situations. Now, even if they didn't have to do so much because Messi was doing the majority, you knew that when push come to shove, most of them guys were going to stand up. So when you look at it from a national context, it didn't always quite work that way, even though the players definitely not park footballers, and in fact sometimes had incredible players in those spots. You look at a guy like Higuain, Messi probably has nightmares about that guy's finishing from time to time because he just didn't do the job when it was required, even though Messi had pushed them all but to the win. So you look at Maradona and he was able to will a team to a title, World Cup, just by simply playing out of his skin, but also he didn't leave it to chance and he didn't rely on those guys so much. Now, I think what you find in a lot of the tournaments now, I'm recording this before the World Cup final, he could very well do that again. This one, I think 2022 is not really an example of this anyway. I think the players have actually delivered and performed when relied upon at this one to a fairly good extent, barring Martinez. His finishing has been Higuain levels at times. But basically, he would have his moments of brilliance at these other tournaments, but he would let other players play, and by letting other players play just that bit too much, like you would at Barcelona, you start to rely on them to put in a decent effort, and they weren't, and it meant they hadn't finished games off, and they were still in games that they shouldn't have been in a lot of the time, and even though Messi was still pretty good, not always so much in the goal scoring at these other tournaments, always, but he was in the position to put them forward, and these other guys didn't quite stand up. So it's just one of those things where the club level has definitely affected how he views the national team level, and then he sort of would overcompensate once it got late stages in these games, because you look at relying on these players and then they're not delivering, then you've got to step up, and it's a lot easier to mark you out of a game if you then have to stand up and try and score, try and do something when everyone knows you're the only one that's going to do it, despite having some incredible players around him that didn't just wouldn't deliver at that level. Actually decide who should be the representative of Argentina after all this, and should any other candidates have actually been looked at? Look, there's a good argument for tons of players. Simeone and his tackling and fierceness at the back certainly typifies Argentine defences. You've got Cambiaso's passing display, especially at that 2006 World Cup. Your Batistutas, phenomenal player, but obviously just not ever at the level. And you got your guys like Riquelme, certainly a hipster's dream player for these tournaments. But it definitely comes down to Messi and Maradona, and the argument that I'm looking at is purely, I don't think Messi happens anywhere near the level of player he is or was without Maradona. I think Maradona informs Messi's style, and I don't even think he may never have gotten out of Rosario if he's not around, because the template for a really short player that can be creative and survive, if Maradona doesn't get over that Bilbao sort of massacre and go on to Napoli and perform and show that a short guy like him can still play at the highest level and still deliver, then maybe he doesn't get the growth hormone he needs at 13 or 14 or whatever age it was. Maybe Barcelona doesn't believe in him. Maybe those around him doesn't quite believe in him. And the template to learn how to play, how to read the game isn't there, and also maybe the blueprint for longevity for his career isn't there either, because you don't have that example of what happens when you do push too hard trying to carry a team for so long. And also the passion for the goals and celebrations and aggressive play style from Maradona just suits what that national team symbolises so much to the fans, even more so than Messi, who definitely does that, but I think he keeps it on the down low. Another thing he's probably learned from Maradona, it keeps him in games much more often, not getting hacked and stuff quite so much for them extreme celebrations and passion in his play. Also, I just think it's impossible to reach the level of fame and attention that Maradona has these days, just because the internet has made every player sort of available. Everything they do is filmed, and it's a completely different thing these days. So, it's Maradona for me. Now on to the next team, Brazil. Now, you could look at any team from the last 50, 60 years, pick the star player, and you'd have a good argument for this case. However, I value your time, so I'm going to look at 3 different attackers from different eras using 3 simple tenets. 1, what did they win with Brazil? 2, how were they affected by sponsorship deals? And 3, what did they do in the club scene, or what kind of impact did they make in world football? The first player I'm looking at is Pele, and he immediately came onto the scene, won that first World Cup in 1958. So automatically that first tenet of winning stuff is fulfilled there. But really the story's more interesting than that. 62, he gets injured after the first game, I believe, and doesn't play again, but they go on to win the World Cup. 66, he gets hacked to near death. They don't win, obviously. And then 70, he returns one last time to be the hero in the final, scores a goal, gets 2 assists, wins a second, technically third. So winning's not a problem for him. And that really sets the scene for what you need to do for every other player. And, I mean, it causes all sorts of problems as well. Sponsorship, he wasn't really affected. I mean, I'm sure he had some sponsorships during when he played, but they were definitely more a part of his retirement career with deals with FIFA, various brands, certain pills, made your blood rise and helped you overlap your winger, if you know what I'm saying. Club level wise, this is the only real problem for him, and it doesn't really matter in this argument, I guess, but he basically was in Brazil most of his career until that last bit where he went to New York. Again, I think that was just a sponsorship kind of thing, looking for those sorts of opportunities, become a global star, become bigger than the game, and he did that, so fair play to him. This argument is the R9 Ronaldo, and of course he sort of rectified that club level mistake of not getting the admiration at a club level in Europe by going immediately over there once he'd proven himself at Cruzeiro. Ended up at PSV, basically tore it up, did that at Barcelona as well, and then led into the 98 World Cup where he basically pushed them to the final, and if his body doesn't collapse and stop him there, even though he played, they definitely have another World Cup, I would say. Factor leading into this that Pele never had to deal with, of course, after his career he did, was the sponsorship and the push by Nike. He basically became the face of Nike, at least for football, going into that World Cup, and there would have been an immense amount of pressure just around that, because marketed as a Brazilian team that played exactly how the stereotype ball and Joga Bonito sort of play out. So definitely a lot of pressure around that. Definitely affected his career to some extent. Goes on to the 2002 World Cup, proves himself there, wins it, and at least gets that first tenet of winning something for the national team there, and sort of an uneventful sort of 2006 in comparison. Definitely a swan song. Other players were definitely the feature of that campaign, so not really his fault there. So he's basically achieved everything you would like out of them 3 central tenets, maybe not as many titles as Pele, and obviously not as popular just because I think the nature of his career. He was a bright light early on, and it diminished a little bit due to those injuries. We're going to look at is a player that sort of has this back to front in a way. I guess you would say it would be successful had he have won everything else, but it's Neymar, so I mean, he had the early Brazilian career like the other 2 did, and then quickly moved on to Barcelona, established himself very quickly in that side. So he got that club acclaim and world level acclaim very early on. He got his brand deal out of the way very early, straight on with Nike. Eventually left them, obviously, but it felt natural for him. He's a much more showy player than even the other 2. Especially off the field. I think he fits that character a lot more than the other 2 did. So them pressures never existed. But the other problem is you have to win at the national level to be accepted on the level of them 2, and he just didn't, because I mean he led them. That home World Cup disaster, of course, struck later on. He got injured, and then the result that they don't speak of happened, but I think really you can't really blame him for much of it. He's a very easy figure to dislike in those situations. A lot of the rolling around and sort of being bigger than the team. But the teams he had earlier on just were not suited to be winning competitions compared to what they were up against. Teams now are quite good. I think they're definitely getting somewhere, but it's in a style that's never really going to please the fans that much. Of course, as we're speaking now, they've just sacked their manager. probably for that reason, really, because the squads are sort of set up to do stuff in tournaments as they've ever have been, really, and certainly I guess the criticism in that is that it's a very European style and defence and central midfield is sort of a bigger tenants of the team than they have been in the past, driving that team forward. And I don't think it's a particularly bad thing. I think all these things we talk about when we think about Brazil are kind of myths, really. Like they've always had players that could do these kind of things. They're just not the players that get acclaimed like others. So it's a hard thing for him. Obviously, Pele wins the battle of the three. I actually think if you're looking for players that typify the team now, you're probably looking at more at Alisson or Thiago Silva or even into the future Bruno Guimaraes. Even if you want a similar comparison to the three we've talked about, Vinicius is obviously the standout there now. But it's a standard that I just don't think can be reached anymore. I think maybe if France win on Monday and then go on to win another one, then that they become like a Brazil type team. But it just doesn't happen anymore where you're winning 2 or 3 in a career's time. So yeah, it's an unsustainable sort of expectation. Now the next team I'm looking at is England, and they're a team that's held to an entirely different standard that causes a lot of problems when you're trying to create this kind of list. They have the same issues as Brazil, where you need to win to be considered sort of the icon of the national team. And in case you haven't really noticed, barring the women's side recently, they don't really win championships that often. So you're pretty much left to 1966, and the captain, Bobby Moore, is probably the best example of everything England wants in a player, because they created the game. And I think just as a general example of being English or British, and having to sort of act as a gentleman as well as being good at your sport, he's about as good an example as you can get. I mean, the way he played certainly suits that kind of messaging, because he from his early upbringing, he trained to not get dirty because his mum was sick of washing his clothes, so he'd stay on his feet, read the game better. I mean, I think, he was perfectly fine as an athlete. I think at the time he certainly ran more than most at his club, but I don't think he was beyond a good athlete. Like, I don't think he was extraordinary compared to some of the players he was playing against, and yet he was able to pick their pockets constantly and look 3 steps ahead of them, as well as kind of having that James Bond style sort of calmness under pressure, I guess, in a way, and everything the English should want from a player, as well as eventually winning that World Cup. So he's pretty much going to be the choice immediately. There's no real competitor in that respect. I'm just going to look at a couple of other players where you could make a case for them in a way, but they certainly don't represent this. And to look for another example, I have to go pretty left field, and that's with Paul Gascoigne, Gazza. So he certainly is not a Bobby Moore type figure in these teams. He's rather a tragic figure. He's sort of a bright spot after coming out of, or still at the very end of the Thatcher era, and that sort of hooliganism era where the club sides were banned from Europe, and a pretty bleak time for that country. And at Italia 90, he shown some absolutely amazing abilities to help push that team to the semi-finals, but I think what makes him stand out as a possible sort of representation for what England stands for in football is that brilliance, but also how it's sort of just clouded by just things can't quite go right. I mean, he had some horrendous ADHD problems off the field, like needed things in the exact place, had to know whether his stove was off at all times, that kind of thing. So he was always juggling something, as well as like the alcoholism of the era, the sort of lads. He sort of typified what an England player meant of that era, but he also just, like, if everything went right, he's probably the best player there, and that's what they could produce. And whether people wanted to acknowledge it or not, he was absolutely the so close but so far version of an England football player we've come to know, sort of the modern era. So I think he's a great example. He's not going to knock off Bobby for the icon, but just a different train of thought. I think with the third and final option, I think there's a player that has a mix of both, and certainly goes close. If they win something in his era, he probably is the man, and that's David Beckham. So definitely not the most talented player amongst that era of player. Certainly showed signs, and it was as technically gifted as anyone. Didn't mind tracking back, doing the work. Free kicks, obviously, amazing. But he sort of had that image that Bobby sort of cultivated by winning the thing, just by being the face of so many tournaments. But then also had the sort of Gaza moment of the send-off early on in '98. Obviously, that clouds a lot of that early time in his career. But then the coming back from it, disappointing Euros for everyone in that 2000. But then the qualifying against Greece with that free kick, I mean, that's sort of St. George hero kind of stuff that they look for, even though obviously it was a qualifier. It wasn't exactly the biggest game in the world, but it meant everything, because if you don't win that, you don't go through. And then he, of course, plays Argentina, gets the penalty, scores against them, and adds redemption. He just obviously didn't get the success that Bobby did to win a title, but he was there often, as was most of that team. I think there'd probably be a case for Michael Owen in a lot of ways. That '98 run was phenomenal, but it was a bright light early that got stifled to injuries, and then maybe a Wayne Rooney a bit later. I think he just never really gets the chance to be the face. I think it's just one of them misfortunes of not being perhaps the best looking man imaginable. He probably, if he looks marginally more attractive, he's probably in the same kind of campaigns, and he definitely has that sort of hero about him. Certainly a lot of players from that era were icons for their clubs, but just never quite reached the country, the national stage sort of hero level. So yeah, he definitely exemplifies that, but he doesn't knock off the top spot. Another honourable mention will be the current team now. I think basically most of the players from that always have the chance to be the next hero, and that's what's so exciting about them. There's a number of players that are phenomenal, and they just need that chance. Saka was so close to a couple of goals there against France. I think if he puts one of them away, obviously the finals in the Euros, the penalties were unfortunate, but a lot of them players, they're that close. And Rashford, obviously off the field, phenomenal, and on the field, like a good player. But just if he just has that moment or two, you'd be the stuff of legend. And I just feel it's just that smidgen out of reach for them, which is a shame. Ultimately, Bobby wins this one pretty straightforward, and we're on to the next country, which is France. For an incredibly successful nation in recent times, just basket case at other times. Like there's not a team with so much talent that has so many issues with their players and attitudes and falling out with managers, and that's certainly something that you have to factor in if you're going to pick a national hero. There's like that flawed genius kind of thing going on. I think an early example of that definitely won't win the award is Eric Cantona, because he's a real what if. Definitely fell out with the manager along with David Ginola, and they failed to after failing to qualify for 1984. That's a real what if. But at the same time, everyone knows his ability and knew how good he was, especially after that Manchester United stint. But the thing about it is, without that happening, you don't start to look at fixing up the academies, fixing up how they go about things, like at Clairefontaine, and you don't get that next generation that comes through quite so quickly, gets pushed through quite so quickly to go on and win France 98 home soil win because them older guys are there and keeping them out. I mean, they had certainly some experienced players go to that tournament, but not quite to the level that they probably would have if them guys had still been around. And that sort of leads the way for the next man that I'll talk about, and that'll be Zinedine Zidane, who, again, I don't think anyone's needs to be told of what he does and why he's so important to such a great team. Just a leader with how he plays, but also exemplifies everything about that modern French team, from the son of immigrant parents, sort of a genius with what he can do with the ball, basically led the team a lot of ways, but also was flawed in temper. And I don't even just mean the obvious one, which is the 2006 final where the headbutt comes, but, known for a tackle here and there that probably was a bit extreme, and that happens with a number of players, obviously, but with the French team, it's generally not your star players, so to have a guy like that doing that and being a key point of your team just sort of absolutely typifies what this team does at times, like absolutely amazing, but can also cause grief. That's why I think a lot of people would argue for Thierry Henry to be a guy that gets mentioned in this argument. But I think he's, apart from a handball against Ireland, he's probably too much of a clean skin in these teams. He just doesn't suit that sort of player. Like, he was phenomenal, obviously. Everyone knows of his abilities, but he just sort of did his job, and that just doesn't typify the kind of player you're looking for when you're trying to give an example of what these teams are like at tournaments and why they matter. Even sort of a flair for the dramatic, because you look at like Euro 2000 and it's Trezeguet that's coming up big for those moments. Like, it's not really him. Definitely didn't underperform, but just not really the guy in terms of who you want to represent this team. Then you have like a modern example of this is a Benzema, and his career's like started really well there with Lyon and getting into that team, but then falling out with the team and being sort of taken away, only for people to realise how much of a genius player he was eventually. I mean, people knew he was good. He played for Real Madrid. He started, but it took those Champions League runs for people to really stand up again and notice the brilliance, and he got back in, and then unfortunately injury struck for this most recent World Cup, and he didn't get to just do it one last time. It could be for the better, because Giroud has really gone on with it, but it's one of those ones where it would have been nice to have seen. Pogba at times also has a bit of that flawed genius as well. That's another player that you could look at for this example, but I don't really think so. Obviously, Mbappe is now going to sort of stand out, and he's got he's had a lot of amazing moments already for this team. Already got a World Cup, potentially has one on Monday as well. Again, sort of missing that sort of streak that puts him in this list, although sort of diva qualities at PSG certainly suggest there could be some of that in the future if things slightly go awry, but no, he's probably too good an example of just a good player that doesn't really cause the problems that others have done. I also think you could look at examples of players that maybe go slightly under the radar in these teams, but help them deliver. I think Griezmann's a phenomenal example. This tournament, he's just played his role. After Pogba and Kante were out, they just needed someone in the middle to do that work, and he's been phenomenal. You look at guys like Vieira, obviously, the ever underrated Makelele. That's another guy that you think about, but I think it has to be Zidane if we're picking a guy to represent this team. And now we're on to our next side, the Germans. And for this team, you've got to look at the two different versions of the side. sort of the 90s era where there's a lot of physicality along with talent, obviously, but definitely a strong focus on being fit and that, and then into the next generation, the more positive generation, very technically gifted players can play anywhere and lock in and play. So definitely a more sort of diverse team as well. An honourable mention early on would be Lothar Matthäus, player that you could definitely talk about for a long time, but he kind of wrecks my argument here, so I won't talk about him. But he's sort of a player that could do a bit of everything everywhere, so he's obviously an honourable mention. But instead, I'll start with the late 90s, sort of early 2000s player, and that's Oliver Kahn. Typifies sort of the big, strong player, a loud guy. I mean, you just have to look at him playing without really hearing too much of it. He obviously didn't mind telling his defenders what to do and where to be, which is what you want from a goalie, of course, but he definitely was imposing. I think he scared most people that were shooting against him. Incredible with some brilliant saves. The 2002 World Cup run was special, and had a couple of injuries in that game and still performed amazingly. Probably the standout performance from a goalkeeper at a World Cup that I can think of. I know there's been plenty, but he certainly is one of them. But he definitely typifies that sort of from the 94 win. He wasn't a part of it, but from that where players were definitely physical specimens first, and then definitely some ability. They certainly had some weird, wonderful strikers in this era. They didn't quite work it out until they got closer. Especially in this World Cup run, the 5-1 loss to England certainly showed that things probably weren't all right, and then somehow they still made the final. It was only at the Euros where they sort of got shown up being inadequate that things began to change, and the work towards the second generation that I'm going to talk about began. So he definitely typifies that. Then my next player is kind of the bridge player between the generations. He played in the Kahn teams and the early versions of the next generation of teams, and I think he's probably the most underrated star player that definitely is known by everyone, but I still think gets underrated, and that's Michael Ballack. And I think, to be honest, it has more to do with his England career, playing at Chelsea. That sort of took away from that. That was a weird era of team. Certainly, when you look at it, what he's done and his time at Leverkusen before moving on to Bayern, he was very productive at Bayern as well. But just a player that just drove teams. Certainly represents something different in the team, being East German, brought up in the era before the wall came down. Certainly changed that mentality. Has very different mentality to a lot of the players in the team normally, as sort of the West German guys. I think he sort of started that mentality in the team of being dominant again, like going out and grabbing the game by the neck, and especially during that 2002 run, which was just one of the all-time individual player moments. If he plays in the final, it could have been different. I don't think they win, but I think he really pushes it another step because he was just a phenomenal player. So he certainly gets to represent the team at the home World Cup and helps bring along a lot of that next generation, and is just sort of, I said he's underrated. Obviously, I think everyone knows him really well and understands his game. But if you go and look at what he's done and sort of highlights and stuff, he's just a player that I think does kind of go underrated compared to, I guess, guys like Gerrard and Lampard from that era are pretty well remembered in comparison. Whereas I think when he was part of Bayern, he was very much on that level, and I don't think it's an argument. And then I think there's a little bit of overlap again to this next generation, and just a player that sort of does. He didn't really play everywhere for Germany so much, did it more for Bayern, but he absolutely could for Germany when called upon, and that's Philipp Lahm. But burst onto the side before, but burst onto the scene at the 2006 World Cup with a phenomenal goal against Costa Rica. It's very memorable as a host team, but just a player that could do everything that was asked of him, had all the physical abilities of the earlier teams that you want, but then showed a greater technical ability and a reading of the game that was missing in those teams that fell short. He did get to stay around until the 2014 World Cup, where they do finally pick up the win, and I think that really was the icing of the cake. But there's any number of players from that era that you could pick to represent this kind of player. I mean, you've got Manuel Neuer, who as a goalie is basically a backline member. Your defenders are like a Watang, who's just all over the park, alongside Hummels, who's a rock, but probably doesn't get the best example of this kind of team. Schweinsteiger is basically a Balak Mach 2, but probably sits back a bit more, and then guys like Podolski, who just has that emotion and definitely had that polished mentality into a team, and a Muller playing up top as well, could sort of float around there in various different ways, whatever the team needed. So very good examples of that kind of player. I also think in the modern era, Kimmich is a great example of that type of player. He's just had some terrible luck with teams in the tournaments. He's obviously blamed them a lot, but the teams still show good examples of this kind of player, like Gnabry as another phenomenal example of the kind of player. And I think we're kind of not talking about Closer enough, because he doesn't really fit into these sorts of examples, but he's a guy that's just consistently performed. I think he's everything that Germany really needs from a player at tournaments, and they don't seem to regularly get, despite this sort of utility type players that they have. So yeah, he's definitely one as well. But I also think Musiala, his tournament was tremendous, and is certainly, I think you give him one or two more, if they get one or two games further, he certainly becomes a lot bigger deal in this tournament. I mean, people know how good he is, but I think he was really actually performing up to the standards people expected, which doesn't happen as often as I think people would like from young players at tournaments, understandably, because the pressure's huge. So having to pick one of these guys is really hard, but I think I'll go Ballack, just on the case of he sort of fits every sort of mould of this team. He's probably not one or the other of the two generations I've sort of picked here, but he sort of fits both. So on that basis, we go Ballack. And now for the next team, which is Italy. And I know you've already got a player in mind for who I'm going to pick here. I think there's an obvious one that everyone will think about immediately. He's Instagram's most popular footballer, and that would, of course, be Andrea Pirlo. And he's not it. I just don't think he typifies what you'd actually want from an Italian team at tournaments and stuff. He's phenomenal and a great player, and yeah, definitely a player that represented the country really well. The free kicks, passing, everything you want from a player. But I think if we're not looking at least goalies or defenders for Italy, then we're doing it wrong. I just think just off that basis, he just cannot be the man that represents this national team. Prototype and why we look at Italian players this way defensively, I think, starts at Dino Zoff, captain, leader from the back, in goals, won a Euros, won a World Cup. And I think from there, defence is the foundation for everything Italian teams do sprung. So he's not going to be a player I pick, or even an example that I'll really talk about, because I had to be honest, outside of World Cup highlights, I haven't really seen enough of him. But he is absolutely the reason. Instead, the first example I'll go for, much in the same way as Pirlo, that he's Instagrammable for probably the hair, the long sleeves, the timing of defence, and that's Paolo Maldini. There's not really too much to say about him. It's obviously just a great example of a defender at this level. Probably, I think he tends to be more remembered for what he does at the club level, whether that's fair or unfair, just because of what the team did during his time playing at the back there, and instead he's more remembered for his Milan tenure instead of the national team. But he's exactly the kind of player you think about. Another example of a player you could look at is Buffon. Just longevity, you could easily consider him as a player that you would pick to represent the national team proudly. The short sleeve shirts, again, some incredible saves, some leadership from the back, absolutely. But in saying that, you have that defensive line in front of you most of the time. When it's good, it's phenomenal. When it's bad, it does look bad because, again, once you base a team on defence, when it's not quite working, it looks really bad. Attack, you just don't score. You base it on attack, you're just not scoring, and it doesn't look so bad. But when your team's so based on defence, it goes wrong, it looks really bad, and it has at times. But yeah, Buffon would absolutely deserve to be a player picked here. I think a very modern example of a player that you could pick is Chiellini. The Euros certainly helped that, winning that and doing everything he could to keep players out of that net, literally pulling Saka back and a lot of other players back to hold on to that hope, and it ultimately worked out for them and got it at the death in penalties, which is just a very Italian sort of style. They failed at that at 2000 Euros and succeeded. That was golden goal, and succeeded at the 2006 World Cup doing just that. So it's a successful style, and it's a player that you should definitely look at. However, it's not the main player that I have chosen. Instead, I'll go for their little leader at the back, Fabio Cannavaro, because he again exemplifies everything you want from this team. He's for the most part very mobile, passes well, gets into position well, is a player that was recognised as the best player during that era where they won the World Cup. Still, I think is Instagrammable as your Perlos, but typifies exactly what this national team is about, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find a better example than that. So Cannavaro is Italy's representative. With that, we now move on to the Netherlands. A player like Cruyff in the 70s lays down what it means to be a Dutch player. Yeah, you need to be skilled, but also technical and thinking about the game. You can progress as a player and improve for your team and how you innovate the position. And that was seen again with the successful side that won the Euros with Rijkaard, Hullet and Van Basten. So they were all great examples of that, but I don't think they exemplify what it means to be the Dutch national team so much, because really from modern memory, it's not about success or even innovation. I think it's about teams that are really all or nothing. They push to the later stages of the tournament, or go out early, or don't even qualify for the tournament. Like, there is no in between, and like these previous generations, there's brilliant skill involved, but also just something that doesn't quite click. They're the squad, aside from France, who love a fallout at a tournament the most. A sort of bad example, because I think he performed pretty well most of the time. It was just an early leave. He didn't really go on to being a real late senior member of the team, is Dennis Bergkamp, and he was tremendous at that 98 World Cup. It was such a memorable moment, the goal against Argentina. But he doesn't really fit, as I think he did nothing but perform for the team, aside from moving along, much like Jaap Stam, who was also like a very influential leader at the back. The Dutch sides of these sort of modern times aren't exactly known for their stability at the back. I think they have a lot of good players. They don't always gel in those positions, and when they do, it tends to be when they do perform. Other guys, like their answer to the Nevilles, the De Boers, another example, I don't think it was a question anyone was asking, but they're all sort of plays you might think about. I think the midfield pairing and a thing that'll come up in a later team, the pairing of Davids and Seedorf, they're both phenomenal players, showed great talent. I think they performed mostly well on the tournament stage. Obviously, I think they tend to be more known for their club efforts, and they're the types of players where you're not exactly going to stand out too much anyway on the national team. If they're doing their job, they're not really as noticeable as some of the forward players, but that they're definitely important parts of these teams and memorable members. Instead, I think the greatest example I can give that suits these Dutch teams is Patrick Kluivert. Come through that Ajax academy, so has that strong pedigree, knows how to play the game, an exciting guy. Bursts onto the scene with that Ajax team, but they go into that '98 World Cup and they perform as a team, and are just unlucky not to go through there. And on the 2000s was when Kluivert really got to shine. He had that hat trick against Yugoslavia, which is one of the all-time great performances in a Euros. He only had 4 actually, but just shows what he could do. But at the same time, just falls short. They don't qualify for 2002. I think the senior members of the team were hardly upstanding at that point. They didn't exactly work together. There was a lot of squabbles, and so they don't go to the World Cup then. 2004 they do, with a new generation who have a lot of players that fit this sort of mould. He goes there, but once again, I think his time's sort of passed. He still wears the number 9, goes through. They get to the semi-finals, but he's hardly the man that gets them there. Injuries become a real problem, and sort of this is around the time he ends up at Newcastle, doesn't get called up for the World Cup squad, and his career's pretty much done. And I think he's just sort of an optical illusion player. I think some people look at him and go, what a wonderful player, did everything. Tremendous on the national stage, and then other people look and what are we really talking about here? I think he's one of those players that people can see it both ways. But then looking on, I think that team in 2004, the emergence of Sneijder, Van der Vaart and Robben, they're all players that are very much in the mould of the Kluivert sort of immense talents from the academy systems in the Netherlands, and performed spectacularly at times, and then other times went missing. I think 2004 was the beginning of that. There was some definite rumblings in that squad, even though they certainly performed well. Van der Vaart seems to be a difficult character at training, certainly at Ajax he was, and in the Dutch camp, Sneijder as well. And Robben just an enigma, not from one of the huge clubs camps originally, so definitely an outlier. Moves to Chelsea at a fairly young age and performs there, and then goes on with it, and just they just never quite work together, and I think they're a hallmark of that Dutch side. You could mention the forwards from this period who were phenomenal, Van Nistelrooy, Van Persie, but I don't actually think they fit in the enigma sort of mould we're going for here. I think they absolutely performed, and along with Sneijder at 2010 World Cup, Van Persie just about pulled them through to the cup. So yeah, I think they're too good, too consistent to fit this mould. I think players like that more fit this mould. And then from the modern team, there's a lot of promising young players that could eventually turn out to do these things. They haven't quite reached the heights I think were expected, maybe, but then they have missed out on a lot of tournaments lately, and when they have qualified, they've been pretty good. Van Dijk's probably a star that people look at and sort of ask, where does he go when these big tournaments happen? But I think injuries have really affected him, and just burnout. I think he's had a lot of big seasons in a row, and he's just sort of not quite performing to the high standards we set for him. So he could potentially be a player that eventually fits this mould, but he's just been really unlucky as well. So with all that considered, I think you have to go Kluivert for the Dutch player. I think he fits better than anyone. And we're now on to our last team. and that is Spain, who fit into two eras for me. The first era, which I think you could sort of term as nothing more than being bottlers, really. If you can even consider bottlers dropping out before the big stages, really. They just never really performed. A team of pretty good stars that just never really fit as a team. I think they lacked a lot of depth in a few areas in those 90s and early 2000s eras before they hit that real golden generation afterwards, and that of course is the second stage. So my perfect example of a player from this first stage is Raul, just a phenomenal player. But I think if you had to ask what was a moment he had for Spain, I'd struggle to think of one. I know people may, but he really was more of a club man, and the flailing sort of Spanish side definitely doesn't help his case. Like, he just wasn't in big enough games, really, because they went out pretty early pretty often. And I remember at the 2002 World Cup where they ended Ireland's run through penalties, but you could just see they were just so nervous for the whole game. You could absolutely sense they could just as easily have gone out, and they were a team that you just never had confidence in. They just didn't look the part at all. So he was a great player and absolutely doesn't really deserve to be labelled with that, but unfortunately he was part of those teams. So he's the guy that exemplifies that, but that's not really how people see Spain anymore at all, obviously, because of that great run of success brought through by a contingent of Barcelona players with the sprinkling of Real players and some attacking flair from your Valencia and Villarreal and Sevilla players and a couple of Premier League players to add spark. But the first guy I'll mention that I think really fits this mould that bridges the gap between the two is Carlos Puyol. He obviously was part of some of them worst teams, and I do seem to remember he hardly ever seemed to embarrass himself in comparison to some of maybe his teammates. But yeah, he then becomes a rock when you add in a midfield as good as that and defenders like PK and whoever's outside him at the time, Capdevila, Alba, all those players. So, and Ramos, of course. So yeah, he's definitely a bridge. I don't think he's going to be the person to pick, but definitely a play you could point to in the change. Instead, obviously, the glaring example that stands out in this Spanish team is the midfield, and I won't pick one player, I'll pick two players here. It's, of course, Iniesta and Xavi. Just an amazing pair that did it for club and country, and without them, none of this is really possible. Their ball movement, goal and distribution sets up that amazing attack with Torres and Villa, whoever you want up top, and those defenders makes their job a lot easier, and just absolutely the way that Spain wanted to play from now on. So they're absolutely the perfect example of everything Spain did in the modern era and of what they continue to try and recreate. Honourable mentions in this part, I guess the most rated, underrated player ever, Xabi Alonso, a player I love and think he's tremendous. In any other national team, he'd be the star for that, but in this team, he was the third member just about of that midfield. And that's if you don't even consider Busquets or Fabregas. So what a midfield, and to have them two consistently in there with all those other options that some would consider better at times is really testament to their abilities. So I think they're a phenomenal example of what Spain is. I think you look at a guy like Torres, could maybe be considered of what Spain would have been if they didn't sort of move in the direction they did. I think he could have become what we saw with Raul. Everything rests on him, and he needed to deliver. And I think without that system, he probably doesn't quite so much. So there's plenty of examples from that Spain team you could go on. Casillas, again, consistently there from those sort of faltering points put in as a young guy to try and steer the ship in the right direction. Maybe this guy has the talent to direct them. He didn't have the defence as he did at Real in those early stages, and it didn't quite work out, even though he was able to pull off some phenomenal saves. He comes into his own as captain of that great side. So there's plenty of options there. I think I'll give it a joint award to Iniesta or Xavi as the two. So they'll be the representatives of Spain. And so there you have it. That's it for our first 8 nations. Brief recap on who we selected. For Argentina, we went for Diego Maradona. For Brazil, we went with Pelé. For England, Bobby Moore. France, Zinedine Zidane. Germany, Michael Ballack. Italy, Fabio Cannavaro. The Netherlands, we went with Patrick Kluivert. And with Spain, we went for the joint combo of Xavi and Iniesta. With that in the books, who do you think we should have talked about? Do you think I missed anyone just in general? I mean, we haven't got all day, so I couldn't talk about everyone, but at the same time, there's definitely some players I missed. Anyone you think I should have talked about, let me know down below. Also, is there anyone you would have selected to represent the national teams that I didn't? Is there any of the players I picked that you disagree with? Let me know why. Also, which nations do you think I should do next in the next video? Obviously, there's a ton of nations I didn't get to. We haven't got all day, so I just went with a couple. But there's definitely some more, and let me know which ones you want to hear about. That just about covers it for episode 1. I'd like you to let me know what you want from the general discussion I have in the next week or two. Do I just give a recap on the World Cup? Maybe look some of the stuff to look forward to in the club scene? Let us know. I appreciate the listen. I would appreciate it also if you'd like and subscribe so we can see the next episodes coming. Otherwise, without listeners, it's not much point doing this podcast. So much appreciated if you can do that. And thank you for making it this long if you have. It's a long one. I don't mind talking, as you can hear, especially about football. So this has been Football Explains Life. Cheers.